the 19th century, the importance of art was usually bound up with its role as public discourse. Without that role, there would have been no avant-garde, because if art doesn't embody values, then it can't act as a conscience. And that was what the avant-garde set out to be when it made its debut in the mid-19th century, the conscience of a class, its traditional enemy and chief patron, the bourgeoisie. What made the avant-garde possible in France, where it was born, was the salon system. Instead of a circle of artists trying to get work from one prince or bishop, you had hundreds, even thousands of easel paintings competing for the attention of thousands of middle-class people. It was more like a bazaar than a court, and it gave more room for invention and scandal and liberty. Anyone could send a picture in, though there was no guarantee that it would be hung. The salon was the theatre in which the drama of offending the bourgeois was played out. Hilton Kramer, art critic of the New York Times.
The relationship of the avant-garde to the middle class is enormously complicated because it like everything else in modern culture, was so changeable. The initial collision, the initial challenge, always within a single generation was resolved into an embrace. What was established taste for the bourgeoisie in one generation was abandoned in a subsequent generation for the taste of what had been conceived to be avant-garde. It's a great misunderstanding of the history, both of 19th century culture and of our own in the 20th century, to hold on to the notion of the avant-garde as sort of permanent cultural guerrillas making their forays into middle-class wealth. They actually were more like family, in which there were conflicts of generations. In the end, as often happens in families, when the wills were read, the avant-garde turned out to be the beneficiary after all.
The first great painter to embody the ideal of the avant-garde was Gustave Courbet in the 1850s and 60s. In politics, a radical. In art, a realist. In person, an invincible and solid egotist who could show himself greeting even the sea on equal terms. He called himself the most arrogant man in France, and when asked which school he belonged to, he replied,
"I'm a Courbetist, that's all. My painting is the only true one. I am the first and unique artist of this century. The others are students or dribblers."
Courbet's work can only be understood in relation to the public that he was struggling to create. This public, he hoped, would crystallize out of the mass audience of the salons around the idea of realism, a public which accepted that art should be challenging and problematic. In short, the public for modern art itself. He set himself firmly against the reigning taste of his day, and the penalty was insult.
From what fabulous mating of a slug with a peacock, from what genital antitheses, from what fatty oozings can have been generated this thing called Monsieur Gustave Courbet? Under what gardener's cloche, with the help of what manure, as a result of what mixture of wine, beer, corrosive mucus, and flatulent swellings, can have grown this sonorous and hairy pumpkin, this aesthetic belly, this imbecilic and impotent incarnation of the self?
They don't write art criticism like that anymore, not because of editorial timidity or the law of libel, but because nobody feels threatened by works of art the way that Dumas felt threatened by Courbet. He used the kind of language that societies use to protect themselves and to punish offenders, and its frenzy as insult was in its way a kind of backhanded compliment, because it sprang from an intense belief that it mattered what art said, and that works of art had real consequences in the real world. To change the language of art, the official visual speech of France, was like seizing the radio station and changing the programs. The new could only shock as long as it was constantly underwritten by the old. Otherwise, why get excited by bits of paint on canvas? From Courbet onwards, the idea of the avant-garde artist as some kind of Bolshevist or anarchist was fixed in the public mind, and it contributed a great deal to the idea that modern art owed nothing to the past and was actually opposed to all traditions. This was nonsense, but it was durable nonsense.
I think that the principal radical effect that the avant-garde has on society, and has had on society, doesn't take place directly in the realm of politics, but takes place in the realm of style and feeling. That is, it prepares the educated segment of a society to question the values that have been handed down. It creates a kind of ferment which prepares the way for vast political change. Its role is to create a model of dissent.
Today, painting and sculpture scarcely have the power left to create such a model. All that happens is that now and again, usually in England or Australia, people get worked up about some object because it seemed not worth the money that a museum paid for it. So it was with Carl Andre's 120 bricks. The essential difference between this kind of sculpture and any that has existed in the past is that this depends not just a bit, but totally on the museum. A Rodin in a parking lot is still a misplaced Rodin, but this in a parking lot is just bricks. In this way, the museum becomes a nearly equal partner with the artist. It helps create the work by providing the only place where an array of bricks can be seen as art and fitted into the context of a minor modern art movement called minimalism. On the street, minimalism doesn't exist. There are only things. This piece by the American sculptor Donald Judd, if you saw it outside the gallery, is just a row of plywood boxes. What the museum gives it is a slot in a debate about the nature and limits of art, and that was the content of the work. The nirvana of boredom that minimalism promised was the exact opposite of the fantasies of action and involvement that political art held out. But the real field of modernist experience lies somewhere between dumb mass propaganda on one hand and the silences of a dying avant-garde on the other. That experience is not collective. In front of a Matisse, you do not hear the chant of surging millions. You hear one voice carefully explaining itself to one person, the interested stranger, yourself. Most of the great voices of modernity come from neither the left nor the right of society, but from just outside it. And the basic reason why the avant-garde had so little influence on action, and such a lot on sensibility, is that it was solitary. William Rubin.
Religious painting ceases. The painting of the political leader disappears. The painting of history as such disappears. All the themes that belong to the collectivity, so to say, disappear. And one of the ways we can define modern art, if we want to, is that it has been an art that did not engage itself in the old collectivities, but rather in a much more limited world of the experience of the artist himself and of the people who loved and were interested in that world. This world of the artist has, of course, since then been commercialized and various other things have happened to it, but let us say in its essence, it was a private world as opposed to the public world which characterized pre-modern art.